Hey guys, tonight we begin with the supposedly glamorous world of ancient Egyptian royalty. Specifically, what it was like to be a servant in Cleopatra's palace. Think working for a demanding celebrity was tough. Try serving a pharaoh who literally believed she was a goddess and had the power to feed you to crocodiles for using the wrong spoon. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, into one of history's most exhausting job markets. Let's start with the biggest misconception about serving in Cleopatra's palace. Most people imagine elegant servants gliding through marble halls, draped in fine linens, living a life of luxury just steps away from the most powerful woman in the ancient world. In reality, being a palace servant was like being a combination personal assistant, janitor, food taster, and occasional human sacrifice, all for wages that barely covered your daily bread ration. This wasn't some ancient Egyptian version of Downton Abbey, where the staff had charming personalities and heartwarming storylines. It was more like working at the world's most demanding resort, except your boss could legally execute you for minor infractions, and your employee handbook was written in hieroglyphs that basically boiled down to "don't mess up or else." Think about your worst boss experience. Now imagine that boss claimed to be the living incarnation of Isis, had unlimited power over your life and death, spoke 7 languages fluently just to make you feel inadequate, and expected you to anticipate her needs before she even knew she had them. Oh, and she was also conducting affairs with the most powerful men in the Roman Empire while managing a kingdom. So her mood could swing from benevolent goddess to vengeful deity, depending on whether Julius Caesar returned her letters promptly. The palace wasn't a cushy government job with benefits. It was a pressure cooker where one spilled drink could mean the difference between a comfortable retirement and becoming crocodile food in the Nile. And unlike modern employment, there was no HR department to file complaints with. Your HR department was Cleopatra herself, and her conflict resolution strategy typically involved creative applications of ancient Egyptian execution methods. 69 BC, Egypt wasn't the romantic, mystical kingdom that Hollywood loves to portray. It was a complex, bureaucratic nightmare that would make modern government offices look like models of efficiency. Alexandria wasn't just some ancient city with pretty architecture. It was the New York of the ancient world, complete with traffic problems, overcrowding, and a cost of living that would make contemporary San Francisco residents weep with recognition. The Ptolemaic dynasty controlled everything from the price of wheat to who could marry whom, and they ran their kingdom like a combination corporation and religious cult. If you thought modern micromanaging was bad, try living under rulers who believed they were literally divine and therefore had opinions about every aspect of human existence, from agricultural policy to appropriate facial expressions during royal audiences. Cleopatra VII. That's our Cleopatra, not one of the 6 other Cleopatras who came before her, because the Ptolemies had about as much creativity in naming as they did in gene pool diversity, inherited this system and ran it like a CEO who'd read too many management books and also happened to believe she was a goddess. She spoke 9 languages, had received the finest education money could buy, and was politically savvy enough to seduce 2 of Rome's most powerful leaders. Basically, she was that overachieving coworker who makes everyone else look bad, except with absolute power and a tendency toward dramatic gestures. The palace complex wasn't just one building. It was essentially a small city within Alexandria, housing thousands of people including nobles, administrators, guards, craftsmen, entertainers, and of course servants. lots and lots of servants. The place needed an army of people to function, from the kitchen staff who prepared elaborate banquets that would make modern celebrity chefs weep with envy, to the bath attendants who maintained the complex plumbing. Systems that were more advanced than what most Europeans would see for another 1,000 years. If you thought navigating office politics was challenging, imagine doing it in a place where your co-workers included scheming nobles, paranoid eunuchs, foreign diplomats with hidden agendas, and guards who were paid better than you and had sharper swords. The palace was less prestigious workplace and more reality TV show where elimination meant actual elimination. Working there meant being part of an elaborate machine designed to project power, wealth, and divine authority to the known world. Every meal, every ceremony, every casual stroll through the gardens had to be perfect because Cleopatra was constantly performing for audiences that included Roman senators, foreign ambassadors, and her own subjects who needed to believe there. Queen was worthy of divine worship. Meet Apollodorus, Cleopatra's personal carpet delivery specialist. Yes, that was actually a job title, and before you laugh, consider that this man had one of the most terrifying positions in the palace. He was the guy responsible for smuggling Cleopatra into Julius Caesar's presence rolled up in a carpet, which sounds romantic until you realize that one miscalculation in carpet rolling technique could have suffocated the Queen of Egypt and started an international incident. Apollodorus wasn't just any servant. He was Cleopatra's most trusted attendant, which meant he had survived longer than most in a position where the life expectancy was roughly equivalent to that of a medieval food taster. He'd been with her since childhood, which in the Ptolemaic court was like being a childhood friend of a mafia boss's daughter. You either became family or you became a liability that needed to be eliminated. But here's where it gets interesting. Apollodorus had to be constantly ready for the queen's most ridiculous schemes. The carpet incident wasn't a one-off romantic gesture. It was just Tuesday for this guy. Need to sneak the queen past Roman guards? Apollodorus had to figure out logistics. Need to make a dramatic entrance at a state dinner? Apollodorus was your man. Need someone to taste your food for poison while also keeping track of your jewelry and remembering which foreign dignitary was allergic to shellfish. That's all in a day's work. The man essentially functioned as a combination bodyguard, logistics coordinator, and theatrical props manager. When Cleopatra decided she needed to arrive at a meeting with Mark Antony, dressed as Aphrodite on a golden barge with purple sails and enough incense to be smelled from 3 miles away, guess who had to make that happen? Poor Apollodorus, probably. Spent weeks coordinating with shipbuilders, perfume merchants, costume designers, and the Egyptian equivalent of a theatrical lighting crew. And unlike modern personal assistants, Apollodorus couldn't just quit if the job got too stressful. He was essentially bonded to Cleopatra for life, which meant that every crazy scheme she dreamed up became his problem to solve. When she wanted to demonstrate her wealth by dissolving a pearl worth more than entire provinces in vinegar and drinking it, Apollodorus had to source the vinegar, verify the pearl's authenticity, and probably practice the stunt beforehand to make sure it wouldn't accidentally poison the queen. The poor man lived in constant fear that one day Cleopatra would come up with an idea so outrageous that even his considerable skills couldn't pull it off. Imagine being the person responsible for making sure every single one of your bosses' Instagram-worthy moments actually worked in real life, except instead of losing followers for a failed stunt, you'd lose your head. Yet somehow, Apollodorus not only survived, but thrived in this environment. He became one of the most influential people in the palace, which tells you everything you need to know about how valuable competent help was in Cleopatra's Egypt. And if you think managing one demanding boss is exhausting, wait until you hear about the army of servants who had to keep the entire palace running smoothly while Cleopatra was busy seducing Romans and plotting to restore Egypt's empire. This wasn't just about surviving a difficult work environment, though difficult doesn't begin to cover working for someone who once had a servant executed for bringing her lukewarm bathwater. The palace servant hierarchy was a complex ecosystem where your survival depended on understanding dozens of unwritten rules, maintaining perfect performance under impossible pressure, and navigating political currents that could shift daily, based on Cleopatra's romantic relationships with Roman leaders. Every servant's life hung in the balance of larger political games they barely understood. When Julius Caesar was assassinated, palace servants didn't just worry about their jobs. They worried about whether the new political reality would mean their execution as potential security threats. When Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony soured, servants who had been associated with Roman visitors suddenly found themselves under suspicion of treason. The stakes were personal, political, and existential. Mess up a minor task, and you might face punishment that ranged from reduced rations to creative execution methods that would make medieval torture devices look merciful. Excel at your duties, and you might gain access to privileges that elevated your family's status for generations. Or you might simply paint a target on your back for jealous colleagues who viewed your success as their threat. Palace life wasn't just employment. It was a high-stakes game where the rules changed constantly. The players held your life in their hands, and the consequences of failure extended far beyond getting fired. Servants had to master everything from proper protocols, serving wine to foreign dignitaries, to memorizing which foods could be served together without creating diplomatic incidents, to understanding the subtle body language cues that indicated whether Cleopatra was in a mood to be approached with requests, or whether she was planning someone's execution. The complexity of maintaining a royal household that needed to impress both Egyptian subjects and Roman overlords created an environment where even the most competent servants lived in constant anxiety. Success meant survival, but survival required perfection in an environment designed to be imperfect. But Apollodorus and his carpet-rolling expertise were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to the bizarre realities of palace service. Every position in Cleopatra's household came with its own unique set of nightmarish responsibilities, impossible standards, and creative opportunities for things to go catastrophically wrong. The queen's daily routine alone required coordination. That would challenge modern event planners, and that was before adding in the complications of managing state dinners designed to dazzle Roman dignitaries while subtly asserting Egyptian superiority. Every meal was a political statement, every outfit choice was a diplomatic message, and every casual conversation was potential intelligence that could affect the fate of kingdoms. From the kitchen servants who had to prepare banquets fit for gods while ensuring nothing was poisoned, to the bath attendants who maintained water systems more complex than most modern spas. Every role in the palace carried responsibilities that would terrify contemporary professionals. And if you think office hierarchies are complicated now, wait until you hear about the intricate social pecking order that determined everything from your sleeping arrangements to your life expectancy in ancient Egypt's most demanding workplace. Kitchen. Duty in Cleopatra's palace. Unlike your assumptions about ancient cooking being simple bread and beer affairs, the royal kitchens were essentially the ancient world's most stressful restaurant combined with a chemistry lab, diplomatic mission, and potential crime scene all rolled into one. The head kitchen staff weren't just cooks. They were combination chefs, pharmacists, cultural ambassadors, and unwitting participants in a constant game of, will this meal start a war or prevent one? The kitchen complex was larger than most modern restaurants, employing hundreds of people in a hierarchy so complicated it would make corporate org charts look simple. You had head chefs who specialized in different cuisines: Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Persian, and various African regional styles. because Cleopatra's dinner guests represented the entire known world, and serving the wrong type of bread to a Nubian ambassador could be interpreted as a mortal insult. These weren't your neighborhood tavern cooks throwing together whatever was available. Palace kitchen staff were culinary artists who had to master techniques that wouldn't be seen in European cooking for centuries. They worked with ingredients imported from across 3 continents, using recipes that were closely guarded state secrets, because apparently even ancient food prep involved espionage. But here's what really made the job terrifying. Every single dish had to be perfect, not just in taste and presentation, but in its political and religious implications. Serve pork to someone who considered it unclean? That's a diplomatic incident. Forget to include the proper ritual offerings in a ceremonial meal? That's blasphemy. Accidentally use an ingredient that might be interpreted as an aphrodisiac when serving a foreign ambassador's wife? That's potentially an act of war disguised. As dinner service dot, the kitchen staff lived under pressure that would break modern professional chefs. Gordon Ramsay's kitchen tantrums would have been considered gentle, constructive criticism compared to what happened when Cleopatra was displeased with a meal. And unlike modern restaurants where the worst consequence of a bad dish is a negative review, palace kitchen mistakes could result in the entire cooking staff being fed to crocodiles as entertainment for the next dinner party. Take the infamous banquet of the dissolved pearl incident. When Cleopatra wanted to demonstrate her wealth to Mark Antony by dissolving a pearl worth more than entire Roman provinces in vinegar and drinking it, the kitchen staff didn't just have to provide the vinegar. They had to source historically appropriate vinegar, ensure it was the right acidity to actually dissolve the pearl, test the mixture beforehand to make sure it wouldn't poison the queen, and somehow make the whole performance look effortless and spontaneous. The head vinegar, specialist. Yes, that was a real position, spent weeks preparing for this stunt. He had to coordinate with pearl appraisers to ensure they were using a genuine pearl of sufficient value to impress Romans, with physicians to verify the safety of consuming dissolved pearl, and with the palace theatrical coordinator to ensure the timing would create maximum dramatic impact. One kitchen servant allegedly spent 3 days practicing the exact hand movements required to dissolve the pearl elegantly, because apparently even waste and extravagance had to be performed with perfect technique. Another legendary kitchen nightmare involved preparing a state dinner for Julius Caesar that required 7 courses, each representing a different Egyptian deity, served in perfect synchronization while maintaining specific temperature requirements and arranged to tell the story of Egypt's divine mandate through food presentation. The logistics alone would have challenged modern catering companies, but these ancient kitchen workers had to manage it using wood fires, primitive cooling methods, and no electric lighting. The meat course required coordination with hunters, animal trainers, and religious officials because the main dish was supposed to feature rare birds that had been trained to perform tricks before being prepared for consumption. Live flamingos had to be taught choreographed movements, then somehow transitioned from entertainment to entree, without disrupting the dinner conversation or traumatizing the Roman guests who weren't accustomed to Egyptian theatrical dining customs. The dessert course was even more complex, a recreation of the Nile River in sugar and honey, complete with moving parts that simulated flooding and recession, tiny sugar sculptures of Egyptian cities, and hidden compartments that released perfumes representing different seasons. Kitchen servants spent months learning to work with sugar in ways that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance, all to create an edible geography lesson that would last approximately 30 minutes before being consumed. One particularly stressed kitchen worker was responsible for the living bread course, bread that was baked with small chambers containing live mice that would run around the table as entertainment. The technical challenges of creating bread architecture that could house live animals while remaining edible, keeping the mice healthy and properly trained, and timing their release for maximum surprise without causing panic among foreign diplomats, required skills that combined engineering, animal training, and performance art. The wine service alone employed dozens of specialists who had to master not just wine selection and serving techniques, but also the political implications of offering certain vintage years to specific guests. Serving wine from regions currently at war with Rome to Roman guests could be interpreted as a subtle threat, while serving too good a wine to a minor diplomat might suggest Egypt was trying to bribe them. And serving too poor a wine could be taken as an insult worth starting wars over. But it wasn't that simple, because palace kitchen work involved contradictions that would drive modern food service professionals to nervous breakdowns. The same meal had to simultaneously demonstrate Egyptian superiority and Roman respect, showcase exotic luxury while maintaining traditional Egyptian values, and satisfy dozens of different dietary restrictions based on religion, politics, and personal preferences that changed depending on current international relationships. Kitchen staff had to navigate competing demands from different palace officials who all had authority over food preparation, but completely different priorities. The religious advisors wanted every meal to properly honor the gods. The political advisors wanted dishes that would send appropriate diplomatic messages. The palace physicians wanted ingredients that would maintain Cleopatra's health and beauty. And Cleopatra herself wanted meals that would impress her guests, while reinforcing her image as both accessible ruler and divine pharaoh. The contradictions extended to practical matters that created daily headaches for kitchen workers. They were expected to prepare exotic delicacies using local ingredients, create elaborate presentations with minimal preparation time, maintain perfect hygiene standards using ancient sanitation methods, and keep costs reasonable while sparing no expense on impressive displays. Even basic ingredient sourcing became politically complicated. Egyptian wheat was considered superior, but serving only Egyptian ingredients to Roman guests might suggest that Egypt didn't value Roman trade relationships. Roman olive oil was politically expedient, but using too much foreign produce could be interpreted as indicating that Egypt couldn't feed itself. Persian spices demonstrated international connections, but too many foreign influences in a single meal might suggest that Egypt was losing its cultural identity. Kitchen workers also faced the impossible task of creating traditional Egyptian meals for a royal family that hadn't actually been Egyptian for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greek Macedonians who had adopted Egyptian customs for political purposes. So, authentic royal cuisine was actually a constantly evolving performance of authenticity that had to satisfy Egyptian subjects, Greek cultural expectations, and Roman political sensibilities simultaneously. The seasonal challenges were equally absurd. Cleopatra expected fresh seafood, regardless of Nile flooding patterns, exotic fruits during seasons when they weren't available, and elaborate ice presentations in a desert climate before refrigeration technology existed. Kitchen staff became masters of food preservation, transportation logistics, and what basically amounted to ancient food science, all while maintaining the illusion that providing impossible ingredients was effortless. The result was a kitchen culture that combined extreme professional pride with permanent anxiety disorders. Successful kitchen workers became celebrities within the palace hierarchy, commanding respect and privileges that elevated their family's social status. But the pressure created an environment where perfectionism was literally a survival skill, and even minor mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Kitchen staff developed elaborate systems for double and triple checking every aspect of meal preparation. Teams of food tasters worked shifts to ensure nothing was poisoned. But they also had to verify that flavors met standards that would satisfy the most sophisticated palates in the ancient world. Recipe keepers memorized preparation methods that were considered state secrets because written records could be stolen by foreign agents or ambitious rivals within the palace. The hierarchy created fierce competition among kitchen workers, but also unprecedented collaboration when facing particularly challenging assignments. When preparing for state visits or major religious festivals, the entire kitchen staff functioned like a military unit, with specialized divisions coordinating timing, presentation, and logistics with precision that would impress modern event planners. But the human cost was significant. Kitchen workers suffered from chronic stress conditions that ancient physicians documented as unique to palace service. Sleep deprivation was endemic during busy periods, as meal preparation often began before dawn and continued past midnight for multi-day festivals. Burn injuries and repetitive stress conditions were common among workers who spent their careers maintaining the superhuman standards demanded by royal service. The psychological pressure created its own pathologies. Some kitchen workers developed obsessive behaviors around food handling, checking and rechecking preparations to the point where it interfered with their efficiency. Others suffered from what we might now recognize as panic disorders, triggered by the constant awareness that any mistake could result in execution. Yet those who survived and thrived in this environment became some of the most skilled food professionals in the ancient world. Palace kitchen alumni were sought after by wealthy households throughout the Mediterranean, and some went on to establish their own successful catering operations, serving the growing class of Roman entrepreneurs who wanted to entertain in Egyptian style. The innovations developed in Cleopatra's kitchens influenced cooking techniques throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. Modern culinary historians can trace specific preparation methods, presentation styles, and even some recipes directly back to techniques perfected under the pressure of royal perfectionism. Meanwhile, while the kitchen staff was performing daily miracles of culinary diplomacy, another group of palace servants was dealing with challenges that made food preparation look simple by comparison. The bathhouse attendants faced the unique pressure of maintaining facilities that had to simultaneously function as spa, political meeting space, religious temple, and potential crime scene. If managing meals for international diplomats while avoiding accidental poisoning seemed complicated, try maintaining water systems that served as the stage for Cleopatra's most important political negotiations. The royal baths weren't just about hygiene. They were elaborate theater sets where alliances were formed, secrets were shared, and the fate of empires was decided while everyone involved was soaking naked in perfumed water, heated to precise temperatures that required constant monitoring and adjustment throughout the day. If kitchen duty was like running a high-stress restaurant where mistakes could get you executed, then working as a bathhouse attendant was like being a combination spa therapist, plumber, political intelligence analyst, and occasional witness to state secrets that could get you killed just for overhearing them. Cleopatra's bathing complex wasn't just about personal hygiene. It was the aquatic equivalent of the Oval Office, where the most important decisions in the ancient world were made, while everyone involved was floating naked in water that had to be maintained at exactly the right temperature, mineral content, and aromatic profile. The royal baths were engineering marvels that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. We're talking about heated pools, running water, sophisticated drainage systems, and climate control that required constant maintenance by teams of workers who had to understand hydraulics, chemistry, and political protocol simultaneously. These weren't simple Roman-style baths. They were elaborate, theatrical sets designed to reinforce Cleopatra's divine status while providing comfortable settings for the kind of negotiations that determined the fate of nations. Bath attendants had the master skills that ranged from advanced plumbing repair to reading the subtle body language cues that indicated whether a conversation between Cleopatra and a Roman diplomat was going well or whether they were about to witness the breakdown of international relations. They were essentially the ancient world's first multitasking specialists, responsible for technical maintenance, customer service, security screening, and intelligence gathering, all while maintaining the illusion that they were invisible background figures. But here's what made the job particularly nerve-wracking. Bath time was when Cleopatra was most vulnerable and most dangerous. She couldn't wear the elaborate costumes and jewelry that reinforced her royal authority, which made her more accessible to assassination attempts. But she also felt more comfortable speaking freely about sensitive political matters, which meant bath attendants regularly overheard conversations about military strategies, diplomatic secrets, and palace conspiracies that could get them killed if the wrong people discovered what they knew. Consider the Great Plumbing Crisis of 47 BC, when Julius Caesar was visiting, and the entire hot water system failed during what was supposed to be a crucial diplomatic bathing session. The head bath attendant, a man named Ketty, who had spent 15 years mastering the complex heating and circulation systems, faced a technical disaster that threatened to embarrass Cleopatra in front of the most powerful man in Rome. Ketty had about 2 hours to restore hot water to pools that normally took half a day to heat properly, using wood-fired systems that required precise timing and fuel management. But he couldn't just focus on technical repairs. He also had to coordinate with palace security to ensure that the maintenance work didn't create opportunities for assassination attempts, with diplomatic staff to manage Caesar's expectations, without revealing the extent of the crisis, and with religious officials who insisted that any disruption to royal bathing rituals would anger the gods. The solution involved a complex workaround that required kitchen staff to boil enormous quantities of water in cooking pots, stable workers to transport the hot water using systems designed for moving grain, and nearly every servant in the palace working together to create a human chain that could deliver heated water faster than the broken circulation system could cool it down. Ketty essentially MacGyvered a temporary hot water system using resources from across the palace complex, all while maintaining the appearance of calm efficiency that was essential to preserving Cleopatra's divine image. But the real drama happened during the Bath of Secrets incident, when Cleopatra invited Mark Antony to join her for private negotiations that were supposed to determine the future of Roman-Egyptian relations. Bath attendants had to maintain perfect environmental conditions for a meeting that lasted 8 hours, during which the fate of the Mediterranean world was basically decided by two people floating in perfumed water while servants tried to remain invisible, despite being responsible for everything from adjusting water temperature to providing refreshments to ensuring that their conversation wasn't being overheard by spies. The logistical challenges were mind-boggling. Water temperature had to be constantly adjusted based on the emotional intensity of the political discussion. Cooler when conversations became heated. Warmer when the mood was romantic, with different aromatic oils added to influence the psychological atmosphere. Bath attendants learned to read political negotiations like meteorologists reading weather patterns, adjusting environmental conditions to support Cleopatra's diplomatic strategies. One bath attendant named Tanit Genet developed a reputation for being able to predict the outcome of political meetings based on how Cleopatra ordered her bath prepared. If she requested rose oil and warm, but not hot water, the meeting would go well. If she wanted cold water with mint, someone was about to be executed. If she requested the special jasmine blend that took 3 hours to prepare properly, she was planning to seduce someone into a political alliance that would reshape international relations. The job also involved managing the complex etiquette that governed who could bathe when, where, and under what circumstances. Different pools were designated for different types of meetings, political negotiations, religious ceremonies, informal social gatherings, and intimate encounters that had diplomatic implications. Bath attendants had to understand the social significance of pool assignments, ensure that the appropriate ceremonial elements were included for different types of gatherings, and maintain security protocols that varied depending on who was invited to participate. The most challenging assignments involved mixed Roman-Egyptian bathing sessions, where attendants had to navigate cultural differences that could accidentally cause international incidents. Romans had different concepts of appropriate bathing behavior, privacy expectations, and social protocols. What seemed like friendly conversation to a Roman diplomat might be interpreted as intelligence gathering by Egyptian security officials, and what appeared to be normal Egyptian hospitality might be viewed as potential bribery or seduction attempts by paranoid Roman visitors. Bath attendants also dealt with the technical challenges of maintaining water quality in an era before modern filtration and chemical treatment. They had to understand which minerals and plant extracts would create the desired health and beauty effects, how to prevent bacterial growth in warm-standing water, and how to manage drainage systems that served dozens of people daily without creating sanitation problems that could spread disease through the palace. Complex. This wasn't an isolated case of overcomplicated royal service. It was part of a broader pattern where every aspect of palace life had to serve multiple functions simultaneously. Bath time combined personal hygiene, political negotiation, religious ritual, health treatment, and social entertainment in ways that created impossible demands on the staff responsible for managing these activities. The pattern extended throughout palace operations. Nothing could be simple or straightforward, because everything had to reinforce Cleopatra's complex political position as Egyptian pharaoh, Greek Ptolemaic ruler, Roman ally, and divine goddess. Every service, no matter how basic, became a performance that required technical expertise, cultural sensitivity, political awareness, and theatrical timing. Bath attendants weren't unique in facing these contradictory demands. Palace gardeners had to maintain landscapes that simultaneously demonstrated Egyptian agricultural abundance, Greek aesthetic principles, and Roman engineering sophistication. Library staff had to manage collections that served as both repositories of human knowledge and political propaganda tools, designed to impress foreign scholars with Egyptian intellectual superiority. The complexity arose from the inherent contradictions in Cleopatra's political situation. She ruled Egypt as a foreign Ptolemaic dynasty member, maintained power through Roman alliances, claimed divine authority based on ancient Egyptian religious traditions, and presented herself as a sophisticated Hellenistic ruler to international audiences. Every palace service had to support all of these identities simultaneously without revealing the tensions between them. This created work environments where servants needed impossible combinations of skills. They had to be technical specialists, and cultural diplomats, security guards and theater performers, maintenance workers, and intelligence analysts. The job descriptions would have confused modern human resources departments because they required expertise in fields that normally don't overlap. The pattern also reflected the broader political reality of Ptolemaic Egypt, where survival depended on managing relationships with multiple power centers that had competing interests and incompatible expectations. Palace servants were essentially functioning as diplomatic support staff in a kingdom that existed at the intersection of African, Middle Eastern, and European political systems that operated according to completely different cultural rules and social expectations. Why this pattern existed becomes clear when you consider that Cleopatra's Egypt was essentially a multicultural empire disguised as a traditional Egyptian kingdom, managed by a Greek ruling class allied with Roman imperial power and dependent on African trade networks. Every aspect of palace life had to navigate this complexity while maintaining the illusion that Egyptian royal authority was natural, uncomplicated, and divinely ordained. The effects were both immediate and long-lasting, creating a palace culture that produced some of the most skilled service professionals in the ancient world, while also generating stress-related health problems that ancient physicians documented as occupational hazards unique to royal employment. Who benefited? Successful bathhouse attendants could leverage their experience into positions with wealthy Roman families who wanted to recreate Egyptian luxury in their own homes. Some became consulting engineers who helped design bathing facilities throughout the Roman Empire, spreading Egyptian hydraulic innovations across the Mediterranean. Others parlayed their intimate knowledge of high-level political negotiations into careers as diplomatic advisors or intelligence operatives, but who suffered the physical demands of maintaining complex water systems in a desert climate, combined with the psychological pressure of working in an environment where minor mistakes could result in execution, created health problems that shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life for palace workers. Ancient medical papyri describe conditions that sound remarkably similar to modern anxiety disorders, repetitive stress injuries, and chronic fatigue syndrome among palace servants. The unintended consequences included the development of a servant class that was perhaps too well informed about state secrets for their own safety. Bath attendants who overheard sensitive political conversations became security risks that had to be managed through a combination of privileges that bought their loyalty and threats that ensured their silence. This created a paradoxical situation where the most competent servants were also the most dangerous to palace security. The innovations in hydraulic engineering, water treatment, and climate control that were developed to meet royal bathing standards had applications far beyond palace service. Egyptian water management techniques influenced Roman engineering projects, and some of the systems designed for Cleopatra's baths were scaled up for public works projects that improved urban sanitation throughout the ancient world. But perhaps the most significant impact was cultural. The idea that bathing could be a sophisticated social activity rather than just basic hygiene spread throughout the Roman Empire and influenced European concepts of luxury and refinement for centuries. The elaborate bathing rituals developed in Cleopatra's palace became status symbols that wealthy Romans competed to recreate, driving demand for skilled Egyptian bath attendants and spreading Egyptian cultural influence throughout the Mediterranean world. How this shaped future developments becomes clear when you trace the influence of Egyptian bathing culture on Roman spa traditions, Islamic hammam designs, and even modern spa and wellness industries that still use techniques and concepts that can be traced back to innovations developed under the pressure of serving a queen who believed she was a goddess and had the political power to make that belief a practical reality for everyone around her. Yet even as bath attendants were performing daily miracles of hydraulic engineering and diplomatic discretion, another group of palace servants was facing challenges that made managing heated pools and political secrets look straightforward. The wardrobe and appearance staff had to navigate the most dangerous territory in the palace: Cleopatra's personal image management. If you thought maintaining perfect water temperature for international negotiations was stressful, try being responsible for ensuring that the Queen of Egypt looked like a goddess every time she appeared in public, while also making sure her appearance conveyed the right political messages to audiences that included Egyptian subjects who expected traditional pharaonic authority, Greek intellectuals who valued sophisticated aesthetics, and Roman politicians who respected power displays that were impressive but not threatening to Roman supremacy. The wardrobe staff didn't just dress a person. They created a living work of art that had to function as religious icon, political statement, and personal expression simultaneously, all while ensuring that nothing in the queen's appearance could be interpreted as weakness, uncertainty, or foreign influence that might undermine her carefully constructed image as the divine ruler of an independent Egypt that happened to be allied with Rome. By 31 BC, the pressure on Cleopatra's wardrobe staff had reached absolute breaking point. This wasn't just about picking out nice clothes. The queen's appearance had become a weapon in an escalating propaganda war with Octavian that would determine the future of the Roman Empire. Every fabric choice, jewelry selection, and makeup decision was scrutinized by intelligence networks across 3 continents, because Cleopatra's image was literally her most powerful political tool, and one fashion misstep could undermine decades of careful diplomatic positioning. The wardrobe department had evolved into something resembling a combination fashion house, intelligence operation, and diplomatic mission. The head costume designer, Iris, commanded a staff of dozens who specialized in everything from Egyptian traditional dress to Greek haute couture to Roman power dressing, because Cleopatra needed to project different messages to different audiences. Sometimes within the same day, the stakes involved weren't just personal vanity. They were existential. Cleopatra's entire political strategy depended on maintaining her image as simultaneously the legitimate pharaoh of ancient Egypt, a sophisticated Hellenistic ruler worthy of Roman respect, and a divine goddess whose authority transcended human political systems. Her wardrobe had to support all of these personas without revealing the contradictions between them, while also sending subtle messages about Egypt's military strength, economic prosperity, and cultural sophistication. But by 31 BC, the margin for error had essentially disappeared. Mark Antony's political position in Rome was deteriorating. Octavian was actively spreading propaganda, portraying Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign seductress who had corrupted Roman values, and Egyptian nobles were beginning to question whether their queen's Roman alliances were protecting Egypt or making it a target for Roman conquest. Every public appearance became a high-stakes performance where Cleopatra's clothing choices were analyzed by friend and enemy alike for signs of weakness, desperation, or foreign influence. The wardrobe staff lived in constant fear that their fashion decisions would be misinterpreted by audiences who were looking for any excuse to justify military action against Egypt. They weren't just dressing a queen. They were creating armor, made of silk and gold for a woman fighting for her kingdoms, survival using weapons of beauty and symbolism. The crisis reached its peak during the infamous wardrobe malfunction of Actium, not the naval battle itself, but the costume disaster that preceded it and nearly cost Egypt the war before the fighting even began. Cleopatra was preparing for what everyone knew would be the most important public appearance of her life, a ceremonial blessing of the Egyptian fleet that would sail against Octavian's forces. This wasn't just a military review, it was a religious ritual where Cleopatra would appear as the goddess, Isis blessing Egypt's holy war against Roman oppression. The costume requirements were impossibly complex. Cleopatra needed to look like a goddess, but not so otherworldly that she seemed disconnected from human concerns. She had to appear wealthy enough to fund a major naval campaign, but not so extravagant that she seemed wastefully frivolous with Egyptian resources. The outfit had to incorporate traditional Egyptian religious symbolism, but also project the kind of sophisticated power that would impress the Roman officers serving under Mark Antony. And everything had to be gorgeous enough to inspire religious devotion among Egyptian sailors, while practical enough for Cleopatra to perform elaborate ceremonial rituals without tripping over her own costume. Iris had been working on this outfit for months, coordinating with goldsmith who created custom jewelry that incorporated protective amulets, textile workers who wove cloth using threads spun with actual gold, and religious advisors who insisted that every element of the costume correspond to specific Egyptian mythological requirements. The headdress alone required the cooperation of engineers who had to design a crown that was impressive enough to be seen by thousands of spectators, while light enough that Cleopatra could wear it for hours without collapsing from exhaustion. But 3 days before the ceremony, disaster struck. A spy working for Octavian had infiltrated the palace workshops and sabotaged the primary costume. Not obviously, that would have been too easy to detect. Instead, the sabotage was subtle, weakened seams that would fail under stress, jewelry, clasps that would break at crucial moments, and fabric dyes that would run if exposed to moisture, turning the queen's divine robes into a muddy mess in front of the entire Egyptian Navy. The discovery came when a junior wardrobe assistant named Amenhotep noticed that one of the golden ornaments wasn't quite the right color. Further investigation revealed the full extent of the sabotage. But by then there were only 72 hours to create an entirely new costume that had to be even more impressive than the original, because news of the sabotage attempt had leaked. And now Cleopatra needed to demonstrate that Egyptian security was strong enough to protect their queen from Roman spies. What followed was a wardrobe staff, equivalent of a military mobilization. Iris commandeered resources from across the palace complex, pulling fabric from ceremonial banners, gold from religious artifacts, and jewels from Cleopatra's personal collection. Every skilled craftsperson in Alexandria was recruited for emergency duty, working in shifts around the clock to recreate months of work in 3 days. But the real drama was psychological. The sabotage wasn't just an attack on Cleopatra's wardrobe. It was proof that Octavian's intelligence network had penetrated to the heart of the palace. Every wardrobe worker was now under suspicion of being a potential spy, which meant that the people responsible for creating Cleopatra's most important costume couldn't trust each other and had to work under guard supervision that slowed down their already impossible timeline. Iris herself was working under conditions that would have broken modern fashion designers. She had to redesign the entire costume concept while managing a staff that included potential enemy agents, coordinate with security officials who treated every wardrobe decision as a potential security breach, and maintain the artistic vision that would make Cleopatra look like a goddess while adapting to whatever materials could be acquired on short notice. The breakthrough came when Amenhotep, the same assistant who had discovered the sabotage, suggested using a technique borrowed from theatrical costume design that would allow them to create impressive visual effects using less expensive materials. Instead of solid gold ornaments, they could use lightweight frames covered with gold leaf that would look equally impressive but could be manufactured much faster. Instead of entirely hand-woven fabric, they could take existing textiles and modify them with embroidered overlays that would create the appearance of completely custom design. The final costume was actually more impressive than the original would have been, because the time pressure had forced the wardrobe staff to innovate techniques that created dramatic visual effects more efficiently. Cleopatra appeared at the fleet blessing looking like a goddess who had descended from heaven specifically to lead Egypt to victory. And the costume was such a success that Roman spies reported back to Octavian that Egyptian morale was higher than ever, and that Cleopatra seemed confident of divine support for her cause. But the real victory was that the wardrobe staff had proven they could maintain Cleopatra's divine image, even under direct attack from enemy intelligence operations. They had essentially outmaneuvered Roman spies using fashion design and emergency tailoring skills. The response was immediate and contradictory. Egyptian nobles were impressed by the wardrobe staff's ability to create an even more spectacular costume under impossible conditions, which reinforced confidence in palace competence and Egyptian resilience. But the fact that Roman spies had penetrated so deeply into palace operations terrified security officials, who began treating every servant as a potential enemy agent. Cleopatra herself was simultaneously grateful for the wardrobe staff success and furious that the sabotage had been possible in the first place. She rewarded Iris and Amenhotep with honors and privileges that elevated their social status. But she also instituted new security protocols that made wardrobe work even more stressful by requiring background checks, loyalty oaths, and constant surveillance of staff activities. The immediate consequences included a complete reorganization of palace security that affected every servant in the complex. Wardrobe workers were now assigned bodyguards who monitored their activities. Mail was intercepted and read, and family members were investigated to ensure they weren't being used as leverage by foreign agents. The paranoia was probably justified, given the extent of Roman espionage operations, but it created a work environment where artistic creativity had to function under military-style surveillance. Roman reactions were more complex than expected. Instead of being discouraged by the failure of their sabotage operation, Octavian's propaganda machine used the incident to portray Cleopatra as vain and superficial, a woman who cared more about her appearance than her kingdom's welfare. Roman writers began spreading stories about the costume crisis. That made it sound like Egypt had nearly lost the war because their queen was obsessed with fashion, completely ignoring the political and religious significance of royal appearance. In Egyptian culture, but other Roman observers, particularly those with military experience, recognized the sabotage operation as evidence that Octavian was taking Cleopatra seriously as a political threat. You don't waste intelligence resources on someone's wardrobe unless you believe their public image is genuinely dangerous to your own political position. The political fallout extended beyond Egypt and Rome. Other kingdoms in the region began reassessing their own security protocols after realizing that if Roman spies could infiltrate Cleopatra's palace, they could probably penetrate any royal household. The incident sparked what amounted to an ancient arms race in palace security that influenced court protocols throughout the Mediterranean world. Perhaps most significantly, the wardrobe crisis demonstrated that in the propaganda war between Cleopatra and Octavian, image management had become as important as military strategy. Both sides were now spending enormous resources on controlling public perception, and the servants responsible for maintaining royal appearances had become legitimate military targets in a conflict that would reshape the ancient world. This wardrobe crisis wasn't just about clothes. It revealed how completely the personal had become political in the final struggle for control of the Roman Empire. Cleopatra's appearance wasn't just personal expression. It was state policy implemented through fashion design. Every costume choice was a diplomatic decision with military implications. What it revealed about the system was that palace service had evolved far beyond traditional domestic work. Servants were now functioning as soldiers in a war fought with symbols and ceremonies and public performances. The wardrobe staff weren't just dressing a person, they were creating weapons of psychological warfare, disguised as fashion statements. The incident exposed the fundamental vulnerability of rulers who depended on theatrical authority. Cleopatra's power was partly based on her ability to appear divine, which meant that attacks on her appearance were attacks on her political legitimacy. Roman strategists had figured out that they could undermine Egyptian morale more effectively by sabotaging costumes than by winning minor military victories. But it also demonstrated the resilience of professional palace staff who had learned to function under impossible pressure. The wardrobe team's ability to create success from near disaster showed that palace servants had developed crisis management skills that would have impressed modern emergency response professionals. Why historians still debate it. The wardrobe crisis encapsulates the larger question of whether Cleopatra lost because she was outmaneuvered politically or because she was facing impossible odds against Roman military superiority. The fact that Octavian felt the need to sabotage her costumes suggests that he viewed her public image as a genuine threat to Roman control. which implies that her theatrical approach to politics was actually effective rather than merely superficial. Around the main dramas of kitchen disasters, bathhouse politics, and wardrobe warfare, a colorful cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that would make modern HR departments weep with confusion over job descriptions that defied every principle of workplace specialization. Neath. The snake charmer wasn't just entertainment. She was essentially Cleopatra's personal psychological warfare specialist. Her official title was Keeper of Sacred Serpents, but her real job involved using trained snakes as living props for political theater that reinforced Cleopatra's connection to Egyptian religious traditions while terrifying foreign diplomats who weren't accustomed to conducting negotiations while deadly cobras slithered around the meeting room. Neith had to master not just animal training, but also political timing that ensured the snakes appeared threatening to enemies while remaining calm around allies, and psychological manipulation that used humanity's instinctive fear of serpents to give Cleopatra negotiating advantages that were completely legal under ancient diplomatic protocols. One Roman senator allegedly agreed to unfavorable trade terms simply because he was too distracted by a cobra wrapped around Cleopatra's arm to focus on the actual contract language, which meant that Neith's snake-handling skills had direct economic implications for Egyptian foreign policy. Kamwasat represented a different aspect of palace complexity as the official guardian of royal fragrance. His responsibilities included everything from managing the perfume supply chain that imported rare aromatics from across 3 continents, to understanding the chemical interactions between different scents that could create either pleasant environments or potentially toxic combinations, to mastering the social significance of fragrance choices that conveyed political messages to audiences who were trained to read olfactory cues as diplomatic communications. When Cleopatra chose jasmine for a meeting, it suggested openness to romantic alliance. When she selected frankincense, it indicated religious authority. When she wore no fragrance at all, it was usually a sign that someone was about to be executed, and she didn't want pleasant associations with the memory. Kamwasat essentially functioned as a combination chemist, diplomat, and psychological profiler who used smell as a tool for managing political relationships in ways that would seem bizarre to modern diplomats, but were perfectly normal in a world where sensory experience was considered an integral part of political communication. Then there was Sobek, whose official position was Keeper of the Royal Laundry, which sounds mundane until you realize that he was responsible for managing textile care in a palace where clothing was essentially military equipment disguised as fashion statements. Sobek had to understand fabric chemistry well enough to maintain garments made from materials that included gold thread, precious stones, and exotic fibers that required specialized cleaning techniques. He also had to coordinate with palace security to ensure that laundry facilities couldn't be used as entry points for assassins, with intelligence operations to verify that cleaning staff weren't foreign spies who might plant tracking devices or poisoning clothing, and with diplomatic protocol officers to ensure that garments were cleaned according to standards that would impress foreign visitors without revealing Egyptian cleaning techniques that might be copied by rival kingdoms. Sobek's laundry operation was essentially a combination textile laboratory, security checkpoint, and industrial espionage prevention system that happened to also get Cleopatra's clothes clean. These weren't isolated eccentrics. They represented the broader pattern of palace service where every position required impossible combinations of technical expertise, political awareness, and personal loyalty that created job descriptions reading like fantasy novel character classes. The palace librarian had to be simultaneously a scholar, a diplomat, a security guard, and a propaganda specialist. The stable master needed to understand not just horse care, but also the symbolic significance of different breeds in international relations and the military applications of transportation logistics. Even the palace musicians were expected to master not just performance techniques, but also the political implications of different musical styles that could either reinforce Egyptian cultural identity or demonstrate cosmopolitan sophistication depending on the audience. These weren't isolated incidents of individual competence. They were part of elaborate networks of cooperation and competition that would make modern organizational consultants either fascinated or horrified by the complexity of workplace relationships that somehow functioned, despite violating every principle of efficient management structure. Consider the Great Perfume Shortage of 46 BC, when a Roman naval blockade disrupted the supply chain for rare aromatics that Camosset needed for Cleopatra's upcoming meeting with Julius Caesar. The fragrance shortage wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a diplomatic crisis that threatened to undermine Cleopatra's carefully crafted image as a ruler whose kingdom commanded resources from across the known world. Camosset's solution required cooperation from servants across multiple palace departments who normally had no reason to work together. Sobek, the laundry keeper, provided insights into which cleaning solvents could be repurposed as fragrance bases, while Meath, the snake charmer, contributed knowledge about natural musk extracts that could be harvested from exotic animals in the royal menagerie. Kitchen staff shared information about spice oils that could substitute for missing aromatics. And even the stable workers contributed by identifying which horses produced the most useful hair for fragrance application brushes. The improvised perfume that resulted from this collaborative effort was actually superior to the original imported version, leading to the development of a distinctly Egyptian fragrance style that became a major export product and diplomatic gift that enhanced Egypt's international reputation. What started as a supply chain crisis became an innovation success story that demonstrated Egyptian self-sufficiency while creating new revenue streams that helped fund the kingdom's military operations. But the personal relationships involved were equally complex. Camosset and Sobek developed a professional partnership that led to advances in textile treatment techniques that made Egyptian fabrics more durable and attractive than competing products from other kingdoms. Their collaboration created innovations that influenced trade relationships throughout the Mediterranean, but it also generated jealousy from other palace workers who felt excluded from the prestigious projects that elevated certain servants to unofficial advisory roles. The political networks extended beyond professional cooperation into personal alliances that sometimes conflicted with official palace hierarchies. Neith's snake-handling skills made her valuable for security purposes, since trained serpents were excellent at detecting intruders who might be invisible to human guards. This led to informal cooperation with palace security forces that gave her access to intelligence information that was supposed to be restricted to official security personnel. When rumors of assassination plots reached Neith through her security contacts, she had to decide whether to share the information with other servants who might be at risk, or maintain the confidentiality that was essential to her continued access to sensitive intelligence. The personal relationships that developed around these life and death decisions created loyalty networks that crossed formal department boundaries and sometimes put servants in positions where they had to choose between official duty and personal friendship. These interconnected relationships also created opportunities for advancement that weren't available through normal palace hierarchies. Sobek's textile expertise and Camosset's fragrance knowledge combined to create luxury products that were so impressive the wealthy Romans began requesting Egyptian servants to manage their own households. Some palace workers leveraged their collaborative relationships into business partnerships that continued after their palace service ended, creating networks of former royal servants who maintained loyalty to each other and to Egypt throughout the Roman Empire. But the interconnections also created vulnerabilities that foreign intelligence operations could exploit. Roman spies learned to target the informal networks that connected palace departments, understanding that servants who trusted each other might share information that they would never reveal under official interrogation. The personal relationships that made palace operations more efficient also made them more vulnerable to infiltration and manipulation by enemies who understood how to exploit friendship and professional cooperation for intelligence-gathering purposes. To understand why palace service was so complicated, you have to understand that Ptolemaic Egypt wasn't just another ancient kingdom. It was a multicultural empire trying to maintain the illusion of traditional Egyptian continuity while adapting to political realities that required constant cultural performance and adaptation. Daily life in the palace reflected this complexity in ways that would confuse modern workplace diversity consultants. Servants were expected to function in Egyptian, Greek, Latin, and various African languages, depending on who they were serving, which required not just linguistic competence, but also cultural literacy that allowed them to switch between different social customs, religious observances, and political protocols within the same workday. Egyptian palace culture maintained traditions that were already ancient when Cleopatra was born, including religious ceremonies that required precise ritual knowledge, seasonal festivals that involved elaborate preparation and performance, and social customs that governed everything from food preparation to clothing choices to acceptable topics of conversation. But servants also had to understand Greek intellectual traditions that influenced palace education and philosophical discussions, Roman political customs that shaped diplomatic interactions, and various African cultural practices that were important for trade relationships and military alliances. What was normal versus exceptional becomes clear when you compare palace life to the experiences of ordinary Egyptians who lived in a much simpler cultural environment where traditional Egyptian customs dominated daily life without the constant code switching that palace service required. Most Egyptians spoke one language, practiced consistent religious traditions, and lived according to social customs that had remained stable for centuries. Palace servants were essentially functioning as cultural translators who had to maintain authenticity in multiple traditions simultaneously while making the whole performance look natural and effortless. They were living anthropologists who had to understand not just their own cultural background, but also the cultural expectations of Egyptian subjects. Greek intellectuals, Roman politicians, and African trading partners who all had different ideas about appropriate behavior, proper etiquette, and acceptable forms of social interaction. This cultural complexity shaped palace events in ways that created constant opportunities for misunderstanding and diplomatic incidents. A gesture that was respectful in Egyptian culture might be insulting in Roman society, while a phrase that was polite in Greek could be politically dangerous if overheard by Egyptian religious authorities. Palace servants had to navigate these cultural minefields while maintaining the illusion that serving multiple cultural communities simultaneously was perfectly natural and uncomplicated. Perhaps most absurd was the fundamental contradiction that made palace service simultaneously the most prestigious and most dangerous employment in Egypt. The closer you got to power, the more likely you were to be killed by that same power, but also the more opportunities you had to gain wealth, status, and influence that could transform your family's circumstances for generations. The irony extended to the nature of royal service itself. Servants were expected to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable, maintaining perfect competence while appearing effortless, demonstrating absolute loyalty while remaining ready to adapt to rapidly changing political circumstances that might require them to serve new masters who had recently been enemies. Even the cultural contradictions were ironic. Palace servants became more sophisticated and worldly than most nobles from other kingdoms. But they couldn't use their knowledge and skills for their own advancement without risking execution for betraying state secrets or appearing to challenge royal authority. The greatest contradiction was that successful palace servants became too valuable to live normal lives, but too dangerous to trust completely. They knew too much about royal secrets to be released from service, but their knowledge also made them constant security risks, who had to be monitored and controlled, even while being relied upon for essential palace functions. Modern parallels to these contradictions are everywhere. High-level political staff, who become unemployable in normal careers because of their security clearances. Celebrity assistants, who gain access to wealth and glamour they can never truly possess. Corporate executives who achieve success by managing organizations they can never truly control. The fundamental tension between competence and security, between usefulness and danger, between privilege and vulnerability, continues to define high-stakes employment relationships in ways that would have been perfectly familiar to Cleopatra's palace servants. Everything changed when Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC forced Cleopatra to completely reinvent palace operations to accommodate a new reality where Egyptian survival depended on managing relationships with multiple Roman factions who were actively trying to kill each other while using Egypt as a strategic resource in their civil wars. The palace service that had been designed to impress visiting dignitaries and maintain royal dignity suddenly had to function as headquarters for international military alliances, intelligence operations, and diplomatic negotiations that would determine whether Egypt remained independent or became another Roman province. The background to this transformation was that Cleopatra had spent years carefully cultivating Caesar as Egypt's protector against other Roman expansionists, only to discover that his death had eliminated the one Roman leader who was powerful enough to guarantee Egyptian independence. Now she faced a political landscape where multiple Roman commanders were competing for power, each offering different deals for Egyptian support, and all of them willing to destroy Egypt if they couldn't control it. Why this moment was different becomes clear when you consider that previous palace crises had been manageable because they involved known quantities, foreign visitors who needed to be impressed, domestic problems that could be solved with traditional Egyptian methods, or political challenges that could be addressed through established diplomatic channels. But Caesar's assassination created chaos in the Roman Empire that made traditional diplomatic approaches impossible, because nobody knew who would ultimately gain power or what their policies toward Egypt would be. The key factors that led to transformation were both external and internal. Externally, Egypt was now receiving competing diplomatic missions from different Roman factions, each demanding exclusive loyalty and military support against their rivals while threatening invasion if their demands weren't met. Internally, Egyptian nobles were beginning to question whether Cleopatra's Roman alliances were protecting Egypt or making it a target for destruction by whichever Roman faction ultimately won the civil wars. Palace servants found themselves dealing with visitors who were no longer just impressive guests to be entertained, but potential conquerors who were evaluating Egyptian resources and defenses while pretending to negotiate alliances. The same Romans who were being served elaborate dinners during the day might be planning invasion strategies during the evening, which meant that every aspect of palace service now involved intelligence gathering and counterintelligence operations. That servants weren't trained to manage. The transformation wasn't just political, it was operational. Palace departments that had functioned independently now had to coordinate with military officials, security forces, and intelligence operatives, who viewed domestic servants as potential security threats rather than palace staff. Kitchen workers found themselves preparing meals for Roman commanders who might be planning Egypt's conquest. Bath attendants were maintaining facilities that served as meeting places for negotiations about Egypt's future. and wardrobe staff were dressing Cleopatra for performances that would determine whether Egypt survived as an independent kingdom. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through a series of increasingly dramatic adaptations that forced palace servants to develop entirely new skill sets while maintaining the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed about Egyptian royal authority or palace operations. Resistance to change came from multiple directions and created conflicts that made palace service even more stressful than it had been during the crisis periods. Traditional Egyptian nobles resented the increased Roman influence in palace operations, viewing the security protocols and intelligence activities as foreign contamination of ancient Egyptian customs. Palace servants who had spent their careers mastering traditional service requirements struggled to adapt to new demands that required political awareness, security consciousness, and cultural sensitivity to Roman military customs that often conflicted with Egyptian traditions. Religious authorities provided some of the strongest resistance, arguing that the militarization of palace operations was compromising the sacred nature of pharaonic authority and reducing Cleopatra from divine ruler to Roman puppet. This created impossible situations for servants who had to maintain traditional religious protocols while adapting to security requirements that treated ancient Egyptian ceremonies as potential opportunities for assassination or espionage. But the champions of change included some unexpected allies who recognized that adaptation was essential for Egyptian survival. Apollodorus, the carpet delivery specialist, became an advocate for the new security protocols because his experience with dramatic gestures had taught him to think about logistics and risk management in ways that translated well to intelligence operations. Kitchen staff who had experience managing complex international menus adapted quickly to the challenge of preparing meals that served multiple political purposes simultaneously. The specific steps of transformation created a completely new palace hierarchy that overlaid traditional Egyptian service roles with Roman-influenced security and intelligence functions. Kitchen workers now reported to both traditional food service supervisors and security officials who monitored their interactions with foreign guests. Bath attendants received training in surveillance techniques that allowed them to gather intelligence while maintaining the appearance of invisible service. Wardrobe staff learned to incorporate security devices in the clothing that would protect Cleopatra from assassination attempts while ensuring that her appearance conveyed appropriate political messages. Obstacles encountered included the fundamental problem that servants were now expected to function as spies and security operatives without losing their effectiveness as domestic workers, which required skills that normally don't overlap. Palace workers had to learn to read body language for signs of hostile intentions while maintaining the submissive demeanor that was essential to their traditional roles. They had to understand political and military intelligence while appearing to be concerned only with domestic service requirements. Breakthrough moments came when servants figured out how to use their traditional roles as cover for intelligence activities that actually enhanced their ability to provide superior service. Bath attendants discovered that understanding the political pressures affecting their clients made them better at providing the kind of relaxing environment that promoted successful negotiations. Kitchen staff learned intelligence about dietary restrictions and cultural preferences of foreign guests, allowed them to create meals that achieved diplomatic objectives while demonstrating Egyptian cultural sophistication. The role of individuals versus larger forces became complicated as some servants emerged as key players in political developments that shaped Egypt's international relationships. Iris, the head wardrobe designer, became an unofficial diplomatic advisor whose understanding of symbolic communication through clothing influenced major policy decisions. Cam Wassett's fragrance expertise became a tool for psychological manipulation that gave Cleopatra advantages in negotiations with Roman commanders. who weren't expecting to be influenced by olfactory cues. But the larger forces were equally important. As the transformation reflected, Egypt's changing position in a Mediterranean world that was being reshaped by Roman expansion and internal Roman conflicts. Palace servants were adapting to changes that were bigger than their individual circumstances or preferences, and their success in adaptation became a factor that influenced Egypt's ability to maintain independence during a period when most other kingdoms were being absorbed into the Roman Empire. The new reality that emerged was a palace that functioned simultaneously as royal residence, military headquarters, diplomatic center, and intelligence operation, all while maintaining the appearance of traditional Egyptian magnificence that was essential to Cleopatra's political authority. Servants had become hybrid civilian military personnel who understood both domestic service and intelligence operations, both Egyptian cultural traditions and Roman political expectations, both individual competence and team coordination that could adapt to rapidly changing political circumstances that required constant innovation and flexibility. The new palace system was a hybrid operation that would have confused organizational management experts while somehow managing to function more effectively than the previous purely traditional Egyptian approach. Palace service had evolved from ceremonial court positions into essential functions in what was essentially a small nation-state's survival strategy, with servants playing roles that combined traditional domestic duties with modern intelligence, security, and diplomatic support functions. How things were different becomes clear when you compare pre-Caesar and post-Caesar palace operations. Previously, palace servants had worked in relatively stable departments with clear hierarchies and predictable responsibilities that changed slowly according to seasonal festivals and occasional diplomatic visits. Now they functioned in fluid teams that reorganized constantly based on intelligence reports, political developments, and military threats that could emerge with little warning and require immediate adaptation of palace operations. Who won and who lost in this transformation reveals the complexity of social change under pressure. Servants who adapted successfully to the new requirements gained access to influence and privileges that elevated them far beyond traditional domestic service roles. Apollodorus became essentially a special operations coordinator. Iris functioned as a diplomatic advisor, and even lower-level servants who demonstrated competence in intelligence gathering gained status and security that protected them and their families. But servants who couldn't adapt to the new requirements found themselves marginalized or eliminated from palace service entirely. Traditional positions that had been prestigious for generations became obsolete as palace operations prioritized military and political functions over ceremonial magnificence. Some servants lost not just their jobs, but their social identity as palace service stopped being about maintaining royal dignity and became about supporting Egyptian survival. The new rules and norms were both more complex and more dangerous than traditional palace protocols. Servants now had to understand not just Egyptian customs, but also Roman military culture, various African political traditions, and the shifting alliance patterns that determined which foreign visitors were honored guests versus potential enemies. Mistake the political affiliation of a Roman commander, and you might accidentally provide military intelligence to someone planning Egypt's invasion. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically shows the persistence of certain aspects of royal authority, even under revolutionary circumstances. Cleopatra maintained her divine status and absolute authority over palace operations, but she exercised that authority through systems that looked more like modern intelligence agencies than traditional royal courts. The hierarchical nature of palace service remained, but the hierarchy now included military ranks and intelligence clearance levels alongside traditional domestic service positions. The physical environment of the palace remained impressive and Luxurious, but luxury now served strategic purposes rather than just aesthetic ones. Elaborate banquets became opportunities for intelligence gathering. Beautiful gardens provided secure meeting spaces for sensitive negotiations. And magnificent architecture demonstrated Egyptian wealth and power to potential allies while intimidating potential enemies. Perhaps most significantly, palace servants had become professionals who possessed skills that were valuable beyond Egypt's borders. Their experience managing complex political relationships, understanding international cultural differences, and coordinating intelligence operations made them attractive employees for wealthy Romans who wanted to establish their own Egyptian style. Households, or for other kingdoms that needed advisors who understood how to navigate the new reality of Roman imperial expansion. Was this change positive or negative for the people actually doing palace work? The answer depends entirely on your perspective and your ability to survive the transition, which not everyone managed successfully. From one perspective, the transformation represented a massive improvement in job security and professional development. Opportunities for servants who proved capable of handling the new requirements. Palace workers gained access to skills, knowledge, and social connections that would have been impossible under the traditional system. And successful servants could leverage their experience into careers that offered much greater autonomy and financial rewards than domestic service typically provided. Different perspectives emerge when you consider the human cost of the transition and the increased danger that came with greater responsibilities. Traditional palace service, while demanding and sometimes arbitrary, was at least predictable in its requirements and relatively safe for servants who mastered the established protocols. The new system required servants to function in environments where political mistakes could result in execution not just by their Egyptian employers, but also by foreign agents, rival political factions, or military commanders who viewed palace staff as legitimate targets in intelligence operations. Short-term versus long-term effects reveal additional complexity in evaluating the transformation. In the short term, the changes created enormous stress and eliminated many traditional career paths that had provided stable employment for generations of Egyptian families. But in the long term, the skills that palace servants developed during this period of crisis enabled them to adapt to the Roman imperial system that eventually absorbed Egypt, giving them advantages in the new political order that servants from other conquered kingdoms didn't possess. Modern judgment versus contemporary views shows that what seemed like desperate adaptations to immediate crises were actually innovations that influenced administrative practices throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. Contemporary observers probably viewed the changes as evidence of Egyptian weakness and foreign dependence, but modern historians recognize them as sophisticated responses to political challenges that demonstrated Egyptian administrative competence and cultural flexibility. The transformation ultimately represented both an ending and a beginning, the end of traditional Egyptian palace service and the beginning of a new model of professional court administration that combined domestic management with political intelligence, cultural diplomacy, and international relations in ways that influenced imperial administration for centuries. In the years following the Roman integration crisis, palace service evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to servants. From Cleopatra's earlier reign, creating a hybrid system that combined the worst aspects of traditional royal service with the additional complications of functioning as support staff for international military and intelligence operations that grew increasingly desperate as Egypt's political situation deteriorated. The new challenges were both predictable and absurd. As Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony deepened, palace servants found themselves managing not just Egyptian royal protocols, but also the personal and political needs of a Roman commander, who was simultaneously Egypt's protector and its greatest liability. Antony brought his own staff, his own cultural expectations, and his own security requirements that often conflicted with Egyptian palace traditions in ways that created daily diplomatic incidents within the royal household itself. Palace operations became a constant balancing act between maintaining Egyptian royal dignity and accommodating Roman military culture, which meant that servants were essentially running two different court systems in the same physical space while pretending that the cultural conflicts and competing authority structures were perfectly normal and manageable. Kitchen staff had to prepare meals that satisfied both Egyptian religious requirements and Roman military preferences, often for the same dinner party, where guests included Egyptian priests, Roman generals, and various international diplomats, who all had incompatible ideas about appropriate food, proper etiquette, and acceptable dinner conversation. The evolution of the situation created opportunities that some servants exploited brilliantly, while others were destroyed by the impossible. Contradictions they were expected to manage without acknowledgement or support. Successful palace workers learned to function as cultural translators who could navigate between Egyptian and Roman expectations while maintaining personal relationships with staff members from both cultures, who often viewed each other with suspicion or outright hostility. Second-generation effects included the emergence of a completely new class of professional court administrators who possessed skills that were valuable throughout the Roman Empire, but were too dangerous to use outside of closely monitored environments. Palace servants had become essentially stateless professionals whose expertise made them valuable to various competing political factions, but whose knowledge of Egyptian state secrets also made them security risks who couldn't be allowed to leave palace service or work for potential enemies. The transformation also created generational conflicts within palace staff, as older servants who had mastered traditional Egyptian protocols struggled to adapt to the new requirements, while younger workers who had been trained in the hybrid system couldn't understand why anyone would want to return to the supposedly simpler traditional arrangements that had actually been quite complex in their own ways but hadn't required servants to function as intelligence, operatives, and cultural diplomats simultaneously. The evolving political situation brought new types of people into palace service who differed dramatically from traditional Egyptian court workers, creating cultural dynamics that would make modern workplace diversity. Consultants either fascinated or terrified by the complexity of managing teams that included people from incompatible professional backgrounds with conflicting loyalties and competing cultural values. Roman military advisors who joined Antony's staff brought professional approaches to administration and security that were more systematic than traditional Egyptian methods, but also more rigid and less adaptable to the fluid political situations that required constant improvisation and creative problem-solving. These Roman professionals were accustomed to clear chains of command, standardized procedures, and predictable operational environments that simply didn't exist in a palace that functioned simultaneously as royal residence, diplomatic center, intelligence headquarters, and military command post. Their contributions included organizational systems that improved efficiency in some palace operations, while creating bureaucratic complications in others. Roman record-keeping methods were superior for managing military logistics and financial accounts, but they were poorly suited to the ceremonial and religious functions that remained essential to maintaining Egyptian royal authority. The Romans also brought security expertise that was valuable for protecting against assassination attempts and espionage operations. But their methods often interfered with the traditional Egyptian customs that were politically necessary for maintaining domestic support. But they also caused disruptions that reflected fundamental differences in cultural values and professional expectations. Roman military culture emphasized hierarchy, discipline, and standardization, while Egyptian palace traditions required flexibility, creativity, and the ability to adapt to the personal preferences and political needs of rulers. who were supposed to be divine rather than merely human commanders. The Romans were often frustrated by what they viewed as inefficient Egyptian customs, while Egyptian servants resented attempts to impose military discipline on activities that they viewed as artistic and religious expressions. The most significant new players were the intelligence operatives who represented various Roman factions and foreign kingdoms that were trying to influence Egyptian policy or gather information about Cleopatra's military capabilities and political intentions. These spies posed as merchants, scholars, entertainers, and even domestic servants, creating an environment where palace workers couldn't trust their colleagues and had to assume that casual conversations might be intelligence-gathering operations. Some of these infiltrators were remarkably sophisticated, bringing professional espionage skills that challenged Egyptian security measures and forced palace administrators to develop counterintelligence capabilities that they had never needed during earlier periods when Egypt's main security concerns involved traditional military threats rather than psychological warfare and political manipulation. Other new players included the growing number of Egyptian nobles, who were hedging their bets by developing relationships with Roman commanders, foreign diplomats, and other potential sources of protection if Cleopatra's political strategy failed. These domestic political rivals created internal security threats that were often more dangerous than foreign espionage, because they had legitimate access to palace operations and intimate knowledge of Egyptian political weaknesses. The palace also attracted increasing numbers of refugees, fortune seekers, and political exiles from other parts of the Mediterranean world that was being disrupted by Roman expansion and internal Roman conflicts. These displaced persons brought skills and knowledge that were sometimes valuable, but they also brought political complications and security risks that strained palace resources and created management challenges that no traditional court system had been designed to handle. But some problems persisted despite all the adaptations and innovations, creating chronic sources of stress and inefficiency that demonstrated the fundamental limitations of trying to manage an ancient kingdom using hybrid systems that combined traditional Egyptian methods with Roman military organization and international intelligence operations. The basic problem of divided loyalty never got resolved and actually became worse as the political situation deteriorated. Palace servants were expected to demonstrate absolute loyalty to Cleopatra while also maintaining professional relationships with Roman staff members who might eventually become enemies, and with Egyptian nobles who were actively planning for political scenarios that didn't include Cleopatra's survival. This created psychological stress that affected job performance and made long-term career planning impossible for palace workers, who couldn't predict whether their skills would be valuable or dangerous depending on future political developments. Resource allocation remained a constant source of conflict as palace operations had to balance the competing demands of maintaining royal magnificence, supporting military operations, funding intelligence activities, and providing diplomatic entertainment that was expensive enough to impress foreign visitors without appearing so extravagant that it suggested Egypt was wasting resources that should have been dedicated to military defense. Palace administrators were essentially trying to run multiple organizations with incompatible priorities, using shared resources that were never adequate for any single function. New versions of old problems included traditional palace rivalries that were now complicated by political and cultural divisions that made personal conflicts into potential security threats. Jealousy between servants who had gained access to Roman training and those who remained in traditional Egyptian roles created workplace tensions that could be exploited by foreign intelligence operatives looking for dissatisfied palace workers, who might be willing to provide information or assistance in exchange for promises of future employment or protection. The cyclical patterns that emerged showed that palace crises were becoming more frequent and more severe as Egypt's political situation became increasingly unstable. Every Roman political development created ripple effects that required palace administrators to reorganize operations, retrain staff, and develop new protocols for managing relationships with visitors who might be allies, enemies, or potential conquerors depending on political developments that were beyond Egyptian control. Why certain issues proved intractable becomes clear when you consider that palace servants were trying to solve political problems that had no solutions within the existing international system. Egypt's independence was being threatened by forces that were larger than any administrative innovations could address, which meant that even perfect palace management couldn't guarantee Egyptian survival in a world where Roman power was expanding faster than diplomatic alternatives could be developed. The fundamental contradiction that couldn't be resolved was that palace operations had to project strength and stability while adapting to political realities that required constant change and flexibility. Cleopatra needed to appear confidently in control while actually operating with very limited options in an international environment where Egypt's fate was being determined by Roman civil wars that were beyond Egyptian influence. Palace servants were essentially trying to maintain the illusion of royal authority while functioning as support staff for political strategies that everyone understood were desperate measures with low probability of success. The stress of maintaining professional competence while knowing that their best efforts might not be sufficient to prevent disaster created psychological problems that affected palace operations even when individual servants performed their duties competently. Compared to earlier periods of Egyptian history, Cleopatra's palace operations represented both the peak of administrative sophistication and the beginning of the end for traditional Egyptian royal authority, creating a unique historical moment where ancient systems achieved maximum complexity just before being eliminated by larger political forces that made all domestic innovations irrelevant. What was unique about this period becomes clear when you compare it to other ancient kingdoms that faced similar pressures from Roman expansion. Most rulers either submitted quickly to Roman authority or resisted until they were conquered and eliminated. But Cleopatra attempted a middle strategy that required palace operations to function simultaneously as Egyptian royal court and Roman military alliance headquarters while maintaining the illusion that Egypt remained independent. The administrative innovations that were developed to manage this impossible situation were more sophisticated than anything that had been attempted in previous Egyptian dynasties, but they were also more fragile because they depended on political relationships that could change rapidly based on events that were beyond Egyptian control. Palace servants had become more skilled and knowledgeable than their predecessors, but they were also more vulnerable because their expertise was specialized for managing situations that might disappear entirely if Egypt's political strategy failed. What was universal about the experience was that palace servants were dealing with the same fundamental challenges that affect administrative personnel in any organization that is trying to manage decline while maintaining the appearance of stability and success. The specific techniques were unique to ancient Egypt, but the psychological pressures and organizational problems were similar to what modern professionals face when working for companies, governments, or institutions that are struggling to survive in changing environments that require adaptation faster than bureaucratic systems can manage. Lessons that could be learned from the Egyptian experience include the importance of developing flexible administrative systems that can adapt to changing circumstances without losing their core functions, and the value of training personnel who can function effectively in multiple cultural contexts without losing their primary professional competencies. But the limitations of administrative innovation become clear when political problems require solutions that are beyond the scope of domestic policy changes. Patterns that repeated elsewhere in the ancient world show that most kingdoms that were absorbed by the Roman Empire went through similar phases of adaptation. resistance, and eventual absorption, but few attempted the kind of comprehensive administrative transformation that Cleopatra's palace achieved. The Egyptian approach was more ambitious and more sophisticated than most alternatives, but it was also more complicated and ultimately no more successful than simpler strategies that accepted Roman authority earlier in the process and avoided the stress and expense of prolonged resistance that delayed but didn't prevent the inevitable outcome. By 32 BC, even the most optimistic palace servants could see that the elaborate system they had spent years perfecting was approaching complete breakdown as Egypt's political situation deteriorated beyond the point where administrative competence could compensate for strategic disasters that were unfolding faster than palace operations could adapt to changing circumstances. The warning signs were both obvious and subtle, creating an atmosphere of impending doom that affected every aspect of palace life while everyone involved tried to maintain professional competence and personal loyalty, despite knowing that their best efforts might not be sufficient to prevent catastrophe. Kitchen staff noticed that food supplies were becoming irregular as trade routes were disrupted by Roman military operations. But they also observed that Cleopatra was eating less and drinking more, suggesting psychological stress that was affecting her decision-making capabilities during a period when Egypt needed leadership that was both decisive and realistic about limited options. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complexity of information management during political crises that unfold faster than communication systems can handle. Palace administrators had access to intelligence reports that clearly indicated Egypt's military disadvantages and the growing political isolation that made diplomatic solutions increasingly unlikely. But they were also receiving conflicting information from various sources that included wishful thinking, deliberate misinformation from enemies, and genuine uncertainty about Roman political developments that were affecting Egypt's situation in ways that were difficult to predict or control. Cleopatra herself was caught between realistic assessments of Egypt's desperate situation and the political necessity of projecting confidence and authority that were essential to maintain domestic support and Roman respect. Palace servants could observe the strain this created, but they couldn't accurately assess whether her public optimism reflected genuine strategic insights or psychological denial that was preventing her from making the kind of difficult decisions that might have improved Egypt's chances of survival. Resistance to inevitable change came from multiple sources that created additional complications for palace operations that were already stressed by impossible demands and conflicting priorities. Egyptian nobles who had invested their careers and fortunes in traditional royal service refused to acknowledge that Cleopatra's strategy was failing, partly because they couldn't imagine alternative approaches that would preserve their status, and partly because admitting failure would have required them to accept responsibility for supporting policies that were leading Egypt toward disaster. Roman advisors who had tied their own political futures to Egypt's success also resisted realistic assessments of the situation, but for different reasons that reflected their understanding of Roman politics rather than Egyptian interests. Many of Antony's supporters knew that Egypt's defeat would probably mean their own execution or exile, which gave them incentives to encourage continued resistance, even when military analysis suggested that surrender might be Egypt's best option for minimizing the damage of inevitable Roman conquest. Palace servants found themselves caught between competing pressures from superiors, who couldn't agree on realistic assessments of Egypt's situation and political strategies that required them to maintain professional competence while preparing for scenarios that might include their own death or enslavement depending on how the final crisis unfolded. The final collapse of palace operations began not with military defeat, but with the psychological breakdown of the command structure that occurred when news of the Battle of Actium reached Alexandria, and everyone involved realized that Egypt's Strategy had failed completely, and that Roman invasion was now inevitable, regardless of any diplomatic or administrative measures that palace staff might attempt. The specific events that marked the end of traditional palace service revealed how quickly elaborate organizational systems can collapse when the political foundations that support them are eliminated by external forces that make domestic competence irrelevant to institutional survival. Within days of learning about Actium, palace departments that had functioned smoothly for years began experiencing coordination failures, resource shortages, and authority conflicts that reflected the broader political chaos, but also demonstrated how dependent complex administrative systems are on stable leadership and predictable operational environments. Cleopatra's final attempts to maintain royal authority while negotiating surrender terms created impossible demands on palace staff, who were expected to support diplomatic initiatives that everyone understood were essentially desperate gestures with minimal chances of success. Kitchen workers had to prepare elaborate banquets for Roman negotiators who were probably planning Egypt's conquest while pretending to discuss alliance terms. Bath attendants maintained facilities for meetings where Egypt's future was being decided by people who had little incentive to preserve Egyptian independence. And wardrobe staff dressed Cleopatra for performances that were designed to delay rather than prevent the inevitable outcome. The final major players included Roman commissioners who arrived in Alexandria to oversee Egypt's transition to provincial status, but also Egyptian officials who were trying to position themselves as valuable collaborators who could maintain some authority under the new system. Palace servants had to navigate relationships with both groups, while uncertain about which authority figures would survive the political transition and which cooperation strategies would provide the best protection for their own survival. Palace operations during the final crisis resembled a combination wake and job interview, as staff members tried to demonstrate their continued usefulness to potential new employers while also maintaining loyalty to Egyptian institutions that were being systematically dismantled by Roman administrators who viewed palace traditions as obstacles to efficient imperial administration, rather than valuable cultural practices that should be preserved. The last attempts to preserve traditional Egyptian royal service created some of the most absurd situations in palace history, as servants tried to maintain ceremonial protocols and religious observances that had lost their political significance, while adapting to Roman administrative requirements that treated Egyptian customs as quaint local traditions rather than legitimate governmental procedures. Cleopatra's suicide represented both a personal tragedy and an administrative disaster that left palace staff without clear authority or guidance about how to manage the transition from royal service to provincial administration. The Roman officials who took control of palace operations were primarily interested in inventory and security rather than maintaining the cultural traditions that had defined palace service for centuries. The dramatic final moments included the systematic dismantling of palace departments that had taken years to develop, as Roman administrators eliminated positions that they viewed as unnecessary luxuries while retaining personnel who could support the more utilitarian functions that were required for provincial administration. Kitchen staff who had mastered the art of diplomatic dining found themselves preparing simple military rations. Bath attendants who had maintained elaborate spa facilities were reassigned to basic sanitation duties, and wardrobe specialists who had created costumes for international theater were employed to maintain uniforms for Roman administrative personnel. The symbolic endpoints were both obvious and subtle, ranging from the removal of Egyptian royal insignia from palace buildings to the gradual replacement of Egyptian administrative procedures with Roman bureaucratic methods that were more efficient, but less flexible and culturally sensitive than the systems they replaced. Palace servants who had functioned as cultural ambassadors and intelligence operatives found themselves working as ordinary Domestic staff whose responsibilities were limited to basic maintenance and service functions that required competence, but not the sophisticated skills they had developed during years of crisis management and international diplomacy. The analysis of causes reveals a complex interaction between internal problems and external pressures that made Egypt's political strategy unsustainable regardless of how competently palace operations were managed or how skillfully diplomatic initiatives were conducted. Internal problems included the fundamental contradiction that Cleopatra's strategy required Egypt to maintain independence while functioning essentially as a Roman protectorate, which created political tensions that affected every aspect of palace operations and made consistent policy implementation impossible. Palace servants were trying to support Egyptian royal authority while accommodating Roman advisors who often had different priorities and conflicting ideas about appropriate strategies for managing Egypt's relationship with Roman imperial power. The resource constraints that had affected palace operations for years became critical as military expenses consumed increasing amounts of Egypt's wealth, while diplomatic requirements demanded continued investment in royal magnificence that was essential to maintaining international respect but diverted resources from military preparation that might have improved Egypt's defensive capabilities. External pressures were ultimately more important than domestic problems, as Egypt's fate was being determined by Roman civil wars that were beyond Egyptian influence, regardless of how skillfully Cleopatra managed her alliances with individual Roman commanders. The fundamental problem was that Egypt's strategy depended on Roman political instability that would allow Egyptian leaders to play different Roman factions against each other. But the victory of Octavian eliminated the political divisions that had made Egyptian independence possible. The role of individuals versus historical forces shows that while Cleopatra's personal decisions were important, particularly her choice to support Antony against Octavian, the broader trajectory was determined by structural factors that made Egyptian independence increasingly difficult to maintain as Roman power expanded and became more centralized under imperial rather than republican institutions. What could have been done differently remains a subject of historical debate, but alternative strategies would have required either earlier submission to Roman authority that would have preserved some Egyptian autonomy while eliminating genuine independence, or military preparation that was beyond Egypt's economic capabilities and probably would have provoked earlier Roman invasion. Palace servants were implementing policies that may have been the best available options given Egypt's limited alternatives and the constraints imposed by geography, resources, and international political developments that were largely beyond Egyptian control. The question of inevitability versus contingency is complicated by the fact that individual decisions and accidental events did influence the timing and specific details of Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire, but the broader outcome was probably inevitable given the trajectory of Roman expansion and the structural imbalances between Egyptian and Roman military capabilities, economic resources, and political organization. Palace operations had become increasingly desperate as servants were asked to support political strategies that everyone understood were unlikely to succeed. But the alternatives were either unacceptable or impossible given Egypt's situation, and the limited options available to a small kingdom that was trying to maintain independence in a Mediterranean world that was being dominated by Roman imperial expansion that was too powerful and too systematic to be resisted by traditional diplomatic and military methods. The human cost of the extended resistance was enormous for palace servants who spent years managing impossible contradictions and adapting to constantly changing requirements. But the political cost of earlier surrender might have been equally devastating for Egyptian culture and institutions that were eventually preserved in modified forms under Roman administration. The immediate aftermath was a combination relief and disaster that created opportunities for some palace servants while eliminating the careers and social status that others had spent their lives developing. who stepped into the vacuum were Roman administrators who had practical experience managing provincial territories but limited understanding of Egyptian cultural traditions and religious requirements that remained important to domestic stability, even under imperial rule. These new managers retained palace staff who could help them understand local customs and administrative procedures, but they eliminated positions that they viewed as unnecessary complications or potential security risks. Short-term consequences included unemployment for many palace workers whose specialized skills were no longer needed, but also new opportunities for servants who could adapt their expertise to Roman administrative requirements. Kitchen staff who understood Egyptian agricultural systems found employment, managing food distribution for Roman military units. Bath attendants who knew hydraulic engineering techniques were hired to maintain public facilities and former wardrobe. Specialists used their knowledge of Egyptian textiles and manufacturing to support Roman commercial operations. Contemporary reactions varied depending on social position and personal experience with palace service. Egyptian nobles generally viewed the end of traditional royal court life as a cultural disaster that eliminated important symbols of Egyptian identity and political autonomy. But ordinary Egyptians were often relieved that the political uncertainty was resolved, even though they regretted the loss of Egyptian independence, because stable Roman administration provided better security and economic opportunities than the chaos that had characterized the final years of Ptolemaic rule. Attempts at revival or continuation were mostly unsuccessful because Roman administration was designed to prevent the kind of independent political activity that would have been necessary to restore traditional Egyptian royal institutions. Some Egyptian nobles tried to maintain informal versions of court culture in their private households, but these efforts were limited in scope and had to be careful not to appear as challenges to Roman authority. The most successful continuations were cultural rather than political, as Egyptian religious traditions, artistic styles, and intellectual practices were preserved through institutions that adapted to Roman rule while maintaining essential characteristics of traditional Egyptian civilization. Palace servants who had developed expertise in cultural translation and international diplomacy during the final crisis were often valuable contributors to these adaptation efforts, using skills that had been developed under pressure to help. Egyptian culture survived in modified forms under Roman imperial administration that was more tolerant of local traditions than many palace workers had expected during the final desperate years of Ptolemaic rule. The legacy of Cleopatra's palace service system shaped administrative practices throughout the Roman Empire and beyond in ways that influenced how complex organizations managed cultural diversity, international relationships, and crisis adaptation. For centuries after Egypt's absorption into Roman provincial administration, specific influences included innovations in household management that combined traditional domestic service with intelligence gathering, diplomatic protocol, and security operations that became models for Roman imperial courts and wealthy private households throughout the Mediterranean. The hybrid administrative systems that had been developed under pressure in Alexandria were adapted by Roman officials who recognized their effectiveness for managing multicultural territories that required sensitivity to local customs while maintaining imperial authority and security standards. How later generations viewed palace service reveals the complexity of historical memory and cultural interpretation, as different groups emphasized different aspects of the Egyptian experience depending on their own political situations and cultural values. Roman writers generally portrayed Cleopatra's court as an example of Oriental luxury and political corruption that justified imperial conquest. But they also acknowledged the administrative sophistication and cultural achievements that were evident in palace operations even during the final crisis period. Greek intellectuals who were absorbed into the Roman Empire often viewed Egyptian palace culture more positively, recognizing innovations in education, library science, and cultural synthesis. that represented achievements in international cooperation and intellectual development. These perspectives influenced Roman imperial policies that preserved and adapted Egyptian administrative techniques rather than simply replacing them with purely Roman methods. The myths versus realities that developed around palace service reflected broader cultural attitudes about luxury, power, and political authority that shaped how different societies understood the relationship between personal service and public administration. Popular narratives emphasize the exotic and dramatic aspects of serving a queen who claimed divine authority. But professional administrators were more interested in the practical techniques that had been developed for managing complex organizations under impossible pressure. Why palace service remained important to some groups while being forgotten by others shows how historical memory is shaped by practical considerations as well as cultural values. Roman administrative officials maintained detailed records of Egyptian governmental procedures because they needed this information to manage their new provincial territory effectively. But popular Roman culture was more interested in stories about Cleopatra's personal relationships and dramatic gestures than in the bureaucratic innovations that had supported her political strategy. Egyptian cultural preservation efforts focused on religious and intellectual traditions rather than palace service specifically, partly because court culture was associated with political independence that was no longer possible under Roman rule, and partly because domestic service wasn't viewed as particularly significant compared to scholarly and spiritual achievements that could be continued under imperial administration. The influence on later governmental systems is visible in Roman imperial administration that adopted Egyptian techniques for managing diverse populations, coordinating complex logistics, and integrating traditional local customs with centralized imperial policies. Some of the administrative innovations that had been developed in Cleopatra's palace became standard procedures in Roman provincial government, though they were usually implemented without acknowledgement of their Egyptian origins. Medieval European courts also borrowed techniques that could be traced back to Egyptian palace culture, particularly approaches to ceremonial protocol, cultural diplomacy, and household management that combined practical administration with symbolic display designed to reinforce political authority. The emphasis on cultural synthesis and international awareness that had characterized palace service in Alexandria influenced European court culture for centuries, though the connections were often indirect and unrecognized by the people who were adapting Egyptian innovations to their own political and cultural circumstances. Today, we can see echoes of Cleopatra's palace service challenges in virtually every high-pressure professional environment where personal competence intersects with political complexity, cultural diversity, and organizational survival under impossible circumstances that require constant adaptation while maintaining the appearance of stability and confidence. The most obvious parallel is in modern diplomatic service, where embassy staff function as combination cultural ambassadors, intelligence gatherers, security operatives, and domestic administrators who must navigate international relationships while serving multiple constituencies with conflicting interests and incompatible expectations. Modern embassy workers face the same fundamental challenge that confronted palace servants, representing their home country's interests while building relationships with local populations, managing security threats while maintaining accessibility, and projecting strength while operating with limited resources in potentially hostile environments. Corporate executives who work for multinational companies in politically unstable regions deal with remarkably similar pressures as they attempt to maintain business operations while adapting to rapidly changing political circumstances that could eliminate their projects overnight. Like palace servants, they must master multiple cultural contexts, understand shifting political alliances, and maintain professional competence while knowing that their best efforts might not be sufficient to prevent disasters that are beyond their control. The specific parallels extend to the psychological stress and impossible job requirements that characterize high-level political staff work in any era. Modern White House staff, parliamentary assistants, and other government workers who serve senior political officials face the same combination of technical expertise requirements, personal loyalty expectations, and political awareness demands that made palace service so challenging. They work in environments where minor mistakes can have major political consequences, where personal relationships blend with professional responsibilities, and where their own career prospects depend on the success of political strategies that they can influence but not control. What hasn't changed about human nature becomes clear when you compare ancient palace politics with modern office dynamics in any organization where personal advancement depends on navigating complex relationships with superiors, colleagues, and outside stakeholders who have different priorities and conflicting loyalties. The specific techniques for managing these relationships have evolved, but the fundamental challenges of demonstrating competence while maintaining loyalty, building alliances while avoiding entangling obligations, and pursuing personal success while contributing to organizational goals remain essentially unchanged. Similar patterns in different contexts are visible throughout modern professional life. From hospital administrators who must balance patient care requirements with financial constraints and regulatory compliance, to university staff who serve multiple constituencies with incompatible ideas about educational priorities and institutional mission. The palace servant's experience of trying to satisfy impossible demands from multiple authority figures while maintaining professional standards under constant pressure is familiar to anyone who has worked in complex organizations where success requires skills that aren't taught in professional training programs. The modern entertainment industry provides perhaps the closest parallel to palace service, as personal assistants, event coordinators, and household staff for celebrities face many of the same challenges that confronted ancient Egyptian palace workers. They must maintain privacy while managing public appearances, coordinate complex logistics while anticipating unpredictable demands, and preserve personal relationships while navigating professional hierarchies that can change rapidly based on factors beyond their control. Even routine corporate service work often involves the same fundamental tensions between efficiency and ceremony, between personal attention and professional boundaries, and between individual competence and team coordination that characterize palace operations. Modern hotel staff, restaurant workers, and customer service representatives regularly deal with situations where their professional success depends on their ability to manage interpersonal relationships with people who have more power than they do, while maintaining service standards that require skills in cultural translation, conflict resolution, and crisis management. The psychological challenges are remarkably consistent across time periods and cultural contexts, as anyone who has worked in high-stress service positions can recognize the palace servant's experience of trying to maintain perfect performance while dealing with impossible demands from people whose satisfaction determines not just job security, but also personal safety and family welfare in environments where the rules change constantly, but the performance standards remain impossibly high. Even now, palace service influences modern areas in ways that are often unrecognized but practically significant for anyone who works in complex organizations where personal service intersects with political authority, cultural diplomacy, and crisis management. Under impossible pressure and constantly changing circumstances, academic study of ancient palace systems provides insights into organizational behavior, cultural adaptation, and crisis management that are relevant to modern business schools, public administration programs, and diplomatic training institutions that prepare professionals for careers in environments where technical competence must be combined with cultural sensitivity. political awareness, and interpersonal skills that can't be learned from textbooks or standard professional training programs. Popular culture continues to draw inspiration from palace service narratives, though usually focusing on the dramatic and exotic aspects rather than the practical administrative innovations that were actually more significant for historical development and modern applications. Movies, television shows, and novels about ancient courts often miss the real complexity and professional sophistication that characterized palace operations, but they preserve public interest in historical periods that might otherwise be forgotten. Political discourse frequently references ancient palace culture as either positive or negative examples of governmental efficiency, cultural sophistication, or political corruption, though these references usually reflect modern political agendas rather than accurate historical understanding. Nevertheless, the symbolic power of palace service as a representation of both governmental competence and potential abuse of power continues to influence public debate about appropriate relationships between political leaders and their support staff. Social movements that advocate for workers' rights, cultural preservation, and political accountability often use historical examples of palace service to illustrate broader points about power relationships, professional dignity, and the human cost of political ambition that requires personal sacrifice from people who lack the resources to protect themselves from exploitation by powerful employers who control their economic and social opportunities. Why people still care about palace service reflects continuing concerns about workplace equity, cultural respect, and the psychological challenges of maintaining professional competence while serving people who have more power, more resources, and more options than the people who work for them, making ancient Egyptian palace culture surprisingly relevant to contemporary discussions about employment relationships, organizational justice, and the ethics of personal service in politically complex environments. Looking back across the decades of palace service during Cleopatra's reign, we've seen how domestic work evolved into something that would have confused modern job classification systems, while somehow managing to function effectively enough to support one of the most sophisticated governmental operations in the ancient world, even as it was ultimately overwhelmed by political forces that were larger than any administrative innovations could address. The key patterns that emerge show how impossible job requirements can create extraordinary professional competence when people are motivated by survival instincts and supported by colleagues who share similar challenges and understand the need for creative problem solving that combines traditional techniques with desperate innovation under constant pressure from authority figures who literally hold life and death power over their employees' welfare and family security. Most surprising discoveries include the extent to which palace servants developed skills that were more sophisticated than what most modern professionals acquired during their careers, partly because ancient palace work required mastery of multiple disciplines simultaneously, and partly because the consequences of failure were so severe that mediocrity wasn't survivable for anyone who wanted to maintain employment in an environment where competence was measured against standards that would terrify contemporary workers who expect reasonable job descriptions and predictable performance metrics. The most important takeaways reveal how human adaptability can function under impossible circumstances, but also how individual competence has limitations when organizational survival depends on political developments that are beyond the influence of even the most skilled and dedicated employees. Palace servants achieved remarkable success in managing the challenges they could control, but their expertise couldn't prevent the collapse of the political system that provided the context for their professional activities. How understanding has evolved shows that modern historians have developed greater appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of ancient administrative systems, recognizing that palace service involved professional skills that were comparable to modern specializations in diplomacy, intelligence operations, cultural anthropology, and crisis management. Though these skills were developed through practical experience, rather than formal education, and were applied in contexts that required constant improvisation rather than standardized procedures. The journey from traditional Egyptian palace service through crisis adaptation to Roman absorption illustrates broader themes about organizational change, cultural adaptation, and professional survival during periods of political transition that eliminated traditional career paths while creating new opportunities for people who can adapt their expertise to changing circumstances without losing their essential competencies. Perhaps most significantly, the palace servant experience demonstrates that professional dignity and personal integrity can be maintained even in employment situations that involve impossible demands, dangerous working conditions, and constant uncertainty about future prospects, though the psychological cost of maintaining high performance standards under these circumstances is enormous and shouldn't be romanticized or treated as a model for normal workplace relationships in societies that have alternatives to survival-based employment contracts. There's one final story that encapsulates everything we've discussed about palace service, and it comes from the very last days before Cleopatra's death, when a kitchen worker named Jetty found himself in the impossible position of preparing the queen's final meal, while knowing that it might literally be her last meal, and that his own survival depended on maintaining professional competence during the most emotionally devastating circumstances imaginable. Chetty had spent 15 years mastering the art of diplomatic dining, creating meals that influenced international negotiations and supported political strategies that had kept Egypt independent longer than anyone had thought possible. He had survived kitchen disasters, political crises, and security emergencies that would have ended the careers of less adaptable workers. But now he faced the ultimate challenge: preparing food for a queen who was planning her own death, while Roman soldiers waited outside the palace to arrest anyone who might be considered a political threat. The practical challenges were absurd in their complexity. Cleopatra wanted a meal that honored Egyptian culinary traditions, while also demonstrating that she remained in control of her own fate rather than submitting to Roman authority. She requested dishes that had personal significance from her childhood, but also foods that would send appropriate messages to the Roman officials, who would inevitably examine everything in the palace for signs of Egyptian resistance or collaboration. But the emotional challenge was devastating. Chetty had to cook for someone he had served loyally for most of his adult life, knowing that his professional competence was contributing to her final act of defiance against enemies who would probably execute him simply for having been present during her last days. He was essentially preparing a funeral meal for someone who was still alive, while maintaining the professional standards that had defined his career and preserving the dignity that was essential to both their survival during these final hours. The meal itself was a masterpiece of culinary art and political symbolism that demonstrated everything palace servants had learned about combining technical expertise with cultural diplomacy and personal loyalty. Chetty created dishes that celebrated Egyptian identity while acknowledging the broader Mediterranean influences that had shaped Ptolemaic culture, honoring both tradition and innovation in ways that reflected Cleopatra's own approach to leadership during impossible circumstances. What this story reveals about palace service is that even during the final crisis, when everything they had worked for was ending and their own futures were uncertain, palace servants maintained the professional competence and personal dignity that had characterized their service throughout years of impossible challenges. They continued to perform their duties with skill and care because that's what professional integrity required, regardless of personal cost or political outcomes. Chetty's experience encapsulates the broader palace servant story: ordinary people who developed extraordinary skills while serving someone who demanded perfection under impossible circumstances, adapting constantly to changing requirements while maintaining standards that would impress modern professionals and preserving human dignity in situations that would have broken people who lacked their training, experience, and mutual support. The final image we should remember is not the dramatic palace scenes that Hollywood loves to recreate, but the quiet professionalism of people like Chetty, who continued doing their jobs competently and compassionately even when they knew that their world was ending and that their expertise might not protect them from the political disasters that were beyond their control, but would determine their fate regardless of how well they had performed their duties. And that, perhaps, is the most human lesson from this journey through ancient palace service. In the end, people do their jobs the best they can with whatever resources and support they have available, adapting to circumstances they can't control while maintaining the professional competence and personal relationships that make him possible. Situation survivable. Palace servants weren't heroes or villains. They were professionals dealing with workplace challenges that were more extreme than most of us will ever face, but fundamentally similar to the universal experience of trying to do good work for difficult employers in complex organizations during uncertain times, when individual competence intersects with larger forces that determine outcomes regardless of personal effort or professional skill. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of what it really meant to work for one of history's most demanding bosses. Now go get some rest, and maybe appreciate that your own job probably isn't quite as stressful as keeping Cleopatra happy during the fall of ancient Egypt.